I now call this special meeting of the Snoqualmie City Council for the midterm budget review. Could you please have roll call?
Councilmember Ross?
Here.
Councilmember Holloway?
Here.
Councilmember Mayhew?
Here.
Councilmember Sundball?
Here.
Councilmember she's not here. It's not here yet.
And I am here. Mayor Matt Larson.
Mayor, excuse me.
I
I
did.
want to note, I believe Councilmember Jeans and Councilmember Munden asked to be excused.
Yes, yeah, Councilmember Jean was out of town, asked to be excused, and saying she lost her babysitter for tonight, so was not able to come in. And who else? We're missing one more, though, right?
Kathy.
Pruitt.
Yeah, Kathy Pruitt.
Probably running a little bit late.
So I may have a motion to excuse the three council members.
So moved.
Second.
All right, a motion and a second to excuse council members Jeans, Pruitt, and Munden. Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion is carried. All right, with that, I'll turn it over to Rob Wharton.
Well, nice to see you. Is this working or not?
Yes.
Yes, it's working.
No?
It's working, Rob.
Yes.
So, this is one of the bad things about coming out of retirement. Tonight, I would be home watching Dancing with the Stars instead of Dancing with the Budget with you people. But we got to do it. So there are a couple things on the agenda tonight, important but horridly dull. One is to review the midterm budget, and during one of the way this works normally is that subcommittees of the council get a chance to hash through the areas that fall into their respective classes. And then we bring it up to a meeting like this. Council committee chairs generally join in talking about what we discussed at the committee meetings, but we haven't met with all of the committees yet. So we have community development, police, transportation, or police, the other part of public safety. We only got to fire the other night. So it's, well, a little bit disorganized, but we'll make it. So at the Finance and Administration Committee, Kathy Pruitt expressed some concern over us not moving too fast to topple over the 3 new council members. So we came primed tonight to give a little background on the budget process and how we got to where we are. Would you be interested in something like that? Okay, we got some slides for that. And then we're gonna, for the audience and for you guys, again, I think you've heard me say this, all except for Mr. Sundvall. This is a 2-year, a biennial budget that we started in 2013, actually. The law, it's 2 one-year budgets. It's a program line item budget. The law requires us to do a midterm review after the first year. It can be, as I've said before, be anything that you want. You know, if you don't want to make any changes to the 2018 budget, we're done. But in fact, there are some that make sense. There are some that are necessary because plans didn't exactly go the way we anticipated in 2017. And there are a lot of amendments to the budget that we save up towards the end of the year, so we don't have to have 2 public hearings on each amending ordinance. So there's that. We also have to certify property taxes tonight. That's a formal process the council goes through to tell the King County, who is it now? The assessor's office. This is different in Pierce County. How much dough we want from property taxes. We get a basic levy plus a couple of increases. And this is really important because the property taxes make up about 53% of the general fund. Half the general fund goes to public safety. So it's a big, and you have some decisions to make about it. One is whether or not we're going to levy the famous Iman 1% increase. So we have to do that tonight. Anyway, the midterm review is not a do-over of the budget. That would, you know, obviate and kind of trash the reason we did the 2-year budget in the first place. And that was kind of get ourselves beyond just 1 year for financial planning. So the rules are, which council can break, Larson breaks the rules all the time. Yes, the rule is, we're not going to do the enhancements over. An enhancement is a new program or new position that departments request in the original budget process. I'm kidding, Bob. What we do is we look at changes. And tonight, throughout most of this, we have wanted to focus, as we have in the past, on the major changes to the budget. And there are a few, the most significant of which is the changes in the financing for the utilities capital improvement plan. So we're poking $18 million into the plan in 2018, reappropriating authorization for some of the projects that didn't get kicked off this year. So that's a big change. And my understanding is you've all had a pretty good look at the utility CIP earlier in the year, but we can still answer questions. So while you were out of the room, they agreed to give us, let them give a little deal on budget essentials. You want to do that?
Sure.
Excuse me, Rob, before you start,
Yeah.
would you like to introduce your compatriot from the finance
Oh,
office?
gosh, so that is a bad manners on my part. By now, everybody knows Drew
actually,
Botte.
Rob, before you move on to that, I know you meant it in good fun. I want you to clarify that because we are live streaming, and you came in kind of late in the game, but things were a little heated and sensitive about some of the rule breaking around here. So
God, okay.
if you could clarify that, please.
That was a joke.
Yeah.
That was a joke. It's actually not larceny. But there's a temptation in the midterm for people to want to load up for stuff we should have reasonably foreseen in the first portion of the biennium. So anyway, larcen's not the biggest. This year it's actually pretty modest, with the exception of the utilities.
Introduce both for persons.
Yeah, I will.
Okay.
So have you all met Drew Botte? I mean, you've seen him at committee meetings. You probably met pretty much who he is. Back here, there's Jerry. Stand up, Jerry, wait. This is Jerry Knutson. He's the resident CPA. So these two guys are your financial management staff in the finance office here. And then the CFO generally contributes a little. Anyway, they're great people. They've been here. Jerry's been here for 10, 15, 10, 11? 9 years. He's got a wealth of experience. He's a great guy. And Drew has turned out to be an incredibly fast study. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you. You do the basics.
Okay.
Give me my notes back.
Yes. There you go. I think you're good.
Okay.
All right. Actually, this is yours too. Sorry. All right. Good evening, Mayor. Good evening, council members. To start off with, we're going to go through basically some essentials with budgeting, and then we're going to describe what the city of Snoqualmie did exactly for the 2017-18 biennial budget process. So you guys have some picture going forward what we plan to do here in the city. You guys might be able, council members, you might be able to make some recommendations for how we can improve the budget process in time. We're more than willing to take those recommendations as well as listen to your questions and comments here today. So I appreciate your attention. So we're going to get into some budgeting essentials right here. This is essentially my definition for budgeting. It's a financial planning exercise that's really conducted within a political environment by officials who are empowered to decide on the use of community resources for the benefit of citizens. Budgeting itself is more than just numbers. It's about choosing from among a variety of alternatives in an attempt to satisfy the sometimes conflicting needs of the community at a reasonable cost. So we're just not here to focus specifically on the finances. We're also here to make decisions on where should we spend our dollars wisely. So as you council members might know, a budget must be balanced, which means essentially matching the anticipated level of revenues with an appropriate level of expenditures. Sometimes, however, the desired level of spending can far exceed our revenue projections. And when we have that condition present inside local government, finance will often spend some time suggesting strategies to accomplish the alignment of expenditures with revenues. We may focus on a number of alignment strategies that could either be short-term or long-term. In terms of a short-term alignment strategy, any proposed spending increase may need to generate sufficient revenue to pay for increased costs. So if you're going to institute a new program, that program better charge fees, basically to recoup the costs of providing that program, especially in a deficit or recessionary environment. In addition to that, another short-term alignment strategy could be any proposed spending increase requires the reduction of an approved appropriation by an equal amount. So if you're going to increase spending in one program area, you have to have an equal reduction in the spending of another program, of a different program. And then in terms of thinking about,
Jim, are you following all this? If you got to slow down, let me.
Yes, I'm following it.
any questions
I'm kidding,
so
of course.
far? Okay. In terms of long-term alignment strategies to make sure that we match expenditures with revenues, we will want to focus as a city on financial management policies and/or practices. Basically to discuss or determine what expected actions we will take to balance the budget and adopt a reserve or stabilization funds if necessary. In addition to that, we might think about creating a strategic plan to help align department decisions with the spending authority you're willing to grant. So in this situation, decision makers such as yourself will set a clear direction for the community, and we will make sure to spend our dollars in accordance with what you want to do. Now, moving away from those strategies that we might deploy in the finance office, in terms of comparing budget methods, I've listed 4 budget methods up here. Basically, a line item budget, a performance-based budget, a program-based budget, and a zero-based budget. They all focus on different things. The line item budget is going to focus at the most granular of detail on the resources that we allocate on a line-by-line basis. If, for example, the city of Snoqualmie was to adopt a performance-based budget, council members, you might be interested in contracting for services with the departments that we have currently here, and they would assure you or provide you with an expected level of performance. If the city of Snoqualmie adopted down the road, say, a program budget, our focus would be on the use of those resources to ensure the short and long-term strategic goals that you council members have decided upon. And then finally, a zero-based budget is relatively different. It's really focusing on the necessity of programs that we have currently to achieve strategic goals. In that situation, you might be reluctant or willing to cut a program if it's not meeting council strategic goals. And so, in terms of the books I've been reading, these different budgeting methods essentially emphasize different aspects. The line item budget really emphasizes control. The performance-based budget really emphasizes management. The program-based budget really emphasizes planning inside the city. And a zero-based budget really emphasizes policy. In terms of a line item budget, council can tightly manage spending to meet operational and capital preferences. If we're operating a performance-based budget, council will often spend time requesting a certain level of performance or checking on evaluating that performance in exchange for new or completed funding. In consideration of a program-based budget, council can expect spending on programs that tackle strategic goals and produce valued outcomes. So council, you would be focused on those strategic goals and what outcomes you hope to see from the departments. And then in terms of a zero-based budgeting world, council can expect all the departments to coordinate spending to address some issue, any problems you might see in this community, or take advantage of opportunities that you want to. The specific budget unit that we review each budget by at the line item, within the line item budget is at the account level. So I know we sent recently this worksheet right here. It's essentially a line item budget, and this is the material that we typically produce to the residents here in Snoqualmie as well as to you council members. And as you can see, all the accounts are broken out line by line for your review. Different from that are the 3 other budgeting methods that I'm showing here. Generally, they focus at the program level, basically taking a number of these accounts and merging them together into $1 amount that we would then write some narrative about and then deliver that to you into the community. In addition, we might represent in that program how many FTEs you're supporting, what are the underfund services transfers looking like, how much revenues we expect those programs to collect, and so on. And it's slightly different, or very different from the line item budget that we currently have. So in addition to that, in this table, I've provided some criticism of the different budgeting methods up here as well, and we don't necessarily have to get into that. But currently, the city of Snoqualmie produces a line item budget. It's incremental in nature, and that's essentially a comparison in budget methods. So any questions or comments based on this slide right here? Different cities focus on different activities. So if you were to check out, say, the city of Sammamish in their budget document, the city of North Bend in their budget document, you're going to see something different from what we produce here. And it's because they focus on different activities.
Drew, is there a
different.
trend that you've seen if people are switching from one, they tend to be moving toward another?
So I would say so. I think one of the things that we brought to council's attention at the last retreat was something called priority-based budgeting. Essentially, priority-based budgeting encompasses all four of these options. So it takes the best out of each one for the most part. And it's something that you would see in, say, Redmond or Bellevue that's highly acknowledged. They're highly acknowledged by the General Government Finance Officers Association for the work that they've done to create a very inclusive budget document that takes into not only council's considerations, but also the residents' concerns, and really delivers a very rational decision-making process. So I mentioned that budgeting is an exercise. Their exercise is really rational in scope. It's data-driven for the most part, and it is very clear in how they're spending the community's money.
It seems to be a trend across the country. I can't say that every city's going to that, but it seems like the folks who want to be more inclusive, more progressive as to how they go about budgeting are leaning towards that, some type of a methodology like that. Well, I know Kathy and Brian earlier this year when we had the budget or the council retreat, we talked about specifically the priority-based budgeting, establishing an organizational and a community-wide goal, or at least a strategic plan for that. And we abandoned that more recently only because of the capacity of the organization to get that done. We are obviously going to bring it up next year in the hopes of perhaps introducing it for the 2019-2020 budget cycle. So as we finish up on this biennial budget process, or biennium in 2018, we'll be hopefully shifting strategies again with the council.
Is there a certain size of city or size of budget, maybe better said, that you need to get to before that type of system works? Is there such thing as being too small to have that work?
I think it's
You mentioned it was a resource
really
issue.
based on the community. For instance, we're a fairly small community, but we're full service. We have all utilities, we have fire, we have police. A lot of larger cities don't even have a full service city. In fact, most of the urban cities in the urban, inside of the, what I'll call the Seattle urban area, Bellevue, Sammamish, all those larger cities, they don't necessarily have their own utilities, especially wastewater like we have as an example. They have a water utility, but it's obviously separate and distinct. They might be part of a water district. We're not part of a water district. We clearly have our own sanitary sewer. So we are at a level that's fairly sophisticated and complicated for a city of our size. There aren't too many cities in this area, especially Washington State, that are a population of 12 to 13 or 14,000 that have all of the services that we render to our community.
I would just add that a lot of it, Sean, is based on the sophistication of your systems and whether you can track in various ways. A lot of low-cost accounting systems are line item based, and so that's kind of where everybody gets rooted in because it's the easiest form to kind of understand. And if you have, say, a treasurer like we did way back when versus a finance officer, you typically start off in more of a line item kind of mentality. And so as you grow, that's when you start looking at these other types of budget tools, and that leads, you got to bring your staff along, you got to bring your system along, and then you've got to bring along your elected so that everybody is really quite grounded in what you're doing. It's not something that you're going to just automatically, you got to kind of work through and figure out how to apply it. But once you apply it, I'm looking at Brian, who, to me, what you're talking about in terms of performance-based budgeting is much easier once you establish the discipline for it. And maybe, Jim, you have a take on it too, but
Well,
that's my experience with it.
I completely agree with all your comments. I think the challenge that I think we want to, going forward, really try and struggle with is forgetting kind of some of the accounting and theory kind of things that we're kind of talking about here. Just take a step back. Drew, could you just hold up that line item budget again?
Sure.
Single-sided or double-sided?
Double-sided.
So
This is 146 pages.
146 pages of fairly small font. So
So it is small font.
yes,
Just go there.
of small font.
Duly noted.
So the challenge I think that we all have, and the challenge I think that our citizens have, is trying to make sense of that. And there's as an aside, there's a whole strategy of dealing with upper management which says, let's just snow them with so much detail they'll never figure out what's really going on. And to an extent, that's effective. So I think the challenge that we really want to focus on is trying to focus ourselves and help our citizens focus on what are they getting for their money?
The
How much
value.
are they spending to get what they're
It's a
receiving?
better story.
It's an even
It's a
harder
story.
story. It's
to have a story.
It is a story, but it's a harder story because now not only do we have all of the challenges that we've kind of mentioned here, but now we're bringing in non-financial data. So if we think about, for example, the police department, our police department already tracks statistics on how many calls they receive, of what priority, and how quickly do they respond. Well, that's all not, our county systems don't have that data. Now if we take that data and say, okay, and now what did that cost us, right? And so you can think about doing that kind of thing in every department. So it's a really fantastic goal, and it's something I think we should get to. And then instead of looking at 146 pages,
146, yes.
146 pages of small font, we're instead looking at much more higher level kind of information and looking at and compared to what we're getting. And then, of course, people can drill down. We're not going to have that other information. It's just that's not what we're going to lead with. And perhaps we're going to let a lot of that detail get managed by city staff as opposed to at more of a policy setting level, which is where we're at the council. So I'd like to see us as we go into that 1920 cycle really start to push as far as we can towards that sort of a story.
Should
And
really,
that's precisely what the priority-based budgeting approach gives you. And it's a kind of a software format or application that's been now vetted by numerous cities or hundreds of cities around the country that we could plug into, and the economies of scale, the cost of doing that is down. It does add some staff time and some resources to do it, because as you said, Jim, the line item budget still, that whole process is still happening underneath, and you can always drill down to that kind of detail. But
That's right, but it may allow some of this, policy level to back out of that detail
Yeah.
and have those conversations more useful.
So we take every department and sort of break it into activities and programs, and then all those would be ranked according to certain criteria and measurements, and put into 4 different quartiles, and then you can kind of see how your budget is really, where you're allocating monies, and quickly kind of get to where, hey, this doesn't seem to be a real high priority item, but we're throwing money at it. Is there an opportunity? But maybe it ranks high from the public in terms of a value, but other partners in the community we could partner with to shift it. So it just gives us a more informative way to, as you said, stay at the really high level, kind of programmatic and activity sort of, and the strategic goals and that sort of thing, and
Great
allocate
idea.
resources that way.
Can I add that even though the worksheet is the worst case, the the system does start from the top down. So you can see major fund summaries. There's a summary by department that's only 1 page long and a snapshot. And in the old days, we put a link on the summary to the detail. I think we'll probably do that again. But as to other statistics and other goals and that you might find in a program budget first before funding, it doesn't do that. So it's a good idea to modify it. I'll also tell you that it may surprise you to learn that our accounting system is cash basis, which I found very unusual when I came here. And it's a good accounting system. It's a lousy reporting system. And I hear now that there are rumors going around that we might opt out of the thing. Going to a full accrual or double entry system, I think, would be a huge step up for the city, but, you know, with certainly a pretty good investment in people and software to get there. But anyway, it's not all as bad as just reading 185,000 numbers on this thing. You can get to higher levels of summary.
You can, but it may be difficult for our citizens to do so if they don't have a strong accounting background. So I think, again, just thinking about helping the citizens, the taxpayers, the ratepayers to understand what's happening with their money, I think is a fantastic goal.
You can get a very good look at the summaries on the preliminary budget that's on our website, so it doesn't have all of this jive in it.
Okay, so I was going to show this slide basically. I know many of you have seen this chart over and over and over again. I don't do this for my own narcissism for the most part, but it's to really hammer home the point of what we're looking to do in terms of the future. Really deliver council a strategic plan for the community. Based on that strategic plan, develop a number of actions in a department work plan for each department that will tackle the strategic plan that you council members set. And then basically making sure that we align our revenues with what you decide in that strategic plan using priority-based budgeting. So we have a concept here. I've thrown this into something I call pyramid of planning. Thank you very much. All right, so moving right along, we can get into the 17-18 budget process. You guys have received a copy of these slides. I'm not sure if you necessarily want to after the discussion that we just had, but I'm open for suggestions. Let's see, I can go back. Let me see if I got the mouse. There it is. I can go back to the agenda. It's hyperlinked. And so got a number of items up here that we could potentially explore if we wanted to go through committee reviews, say the Parks and Public Works Department, the Finance Administration Department, as well as the Public Safety, Committee. You can certainly do so as well. It's up to you guys where you want to head from here.
Well, I had that on my agenda. I'm on 2 of the committees. Brian, are you prepared for Parks?
Yeah, the only thing we discussed with Parks, so yeah, we can.
No, let's start there.
Okay, so I'm going to get into, whoops, gotta go back one. Go. Let's see, hopefully this isn't very sensitive. Okay, I gotta find my place. Just 1 second. Brian, if you don't mind, if you want to speak a little bit about what we discussed at your committee.
I'm willing, let's just dive into it. I
Okay.
don't need a long preamble.
Okay,
But you're supposed to be filling up while Drew finds his page.
thank you.
Come on, Brian.
Very helpful, yeah.
Dance.
I got your back.
Thank you, Kathy. All right, so getting into what we discussed at the Parks and Public Works Committee, essentially, this committee really focused on parks as well as utilities. We're saving transportation for the next committee meeting next week. And just to get right into it, we discussed the changes in expenditure authority for one department as well as 3 different funds. I've got the department and the 3 funds listed up there. Essentially, the park operations division of the Parks and Public Works Department maintains, operates, and schedules the use of parks, open spaces, and athletic fields for the city. The King County Trails Levy Fund that you see up there accounts for the King County Parks Open Space and Trails Revenue Sharing Program. It's used for the acquisition and development of open space of trail projects that connect to the regional trail system. The Jeannie Hansen Turf Replacement Fund 122 up there is used to accumulate money for the eventual replacement of synthetic fields at Jeannie Hansen Park. And then finally, the Parks Improvement Fund 303 is used for the design and construction of parks-related capital improvement projects. As you can see, the most dramatic changes are in the Parks Operations Fund, as well as the King County Trails Levy Fund. And just to get into that a little bit,
Why don't you let me
go ahead.
jump in, would you mind? So there's two big changes in the Parks Operations Department, $158,000 appropriation adjustment for landscape services and $136,000 appropriation for the utility bills, water, sewer, and storm. This is on us. These were both under budgeted. I don't know why. Last year in the utility bills that Parks pays for water, sewer, and storm was $180,000. For some reason, we budgeted only $190 this year. Sounds like we may have dropped a digit. So the $136,000 adjustment for water is just a goof up on our part. The other one is a $158,000 appropriation adjustment for landscape services. This account is only for Northwest Landscape Services. It's about $15,000 a month. It's been that way for a time. Again, we just made a mistake in the number. And so we budgeted $25,000 for it. Last year we spent $129,000. Again, we may have dropped a digit. Anyway, those two appropriations just check and correct a muff up on our part.
Okay, and then moving on to the King County Trails Levy Fund, you see $155,000 basically to support a community park trail project. This trail project is between the elementary school, Cascade View Elementary School, and the YMCA, moving up towards Curtis Drive from Southeast Ridge Street. And council members, you approved this change in Agenda Bill 17138 into the Parks Improvement Fund 303. $68,000 was moved from the to the Koinonia Park to support improvements there, and that replaced $68,000 allocated for the purchase of new lights in Railroad Park. We have a separate plan for the purchase of those lights at Railroad Park that will be coming.
Wait, let's back up.
Go ahead.
To make it clear,
Go ahead.
we took we had $68,000 allocated for new lights in
Yes.
the Railroad Park.
Clear.
We've taken that $68,000 and we have redirected it to Coinonia Park. I probably mispronounced that, but to that park to actually do design of new park equipment for that park. It's really an underdeveloped park.
So Railroad Park has very poor lighting in it, so what's the plan for fixing the
It will come
lighting?
in as what phase of downtown,
Phase
Dan?
3.
Are we
grants
doing it under that? Okay.
It'll come in as part of phase 3 for downtown.
Okay, so we're just
Shifting it.
shifting, thank you.
With being fairly confident that it'll largely be paid for out of the grants from the Phase 3 funding.
Okay.
And phase 3's timing is when?
I'm sorry,
Phase 3 timing is when?
Dan? We've kind of intentionally delayed it to give the reprieve for the retailers downtown.
We're currently working on the Phase 3A design, so we'll be looking at the next phases and where that park falls. I'll have to get back to you at that time frame.
Is this a 2019, 2020, 2021?
Design, we're currently letting the Phase 1 and 2 develop and restore itself, if you will. So Phase 3 design will be done in 18. Construction will be delayed
Until we're ready to,
till you're ready to pull the trigger.
We decide.
So I would really recommend that if it's going to be delayed more than, 2019 shovel in the ground, you do something about lighting in that park because it's not usable after dark. You can't walk
Okay?
on those paths. Remember, they're a lot of them are cobblestone, and I think there is a security or a insurance risk there. And so I would just keep that in mind. I don't want to cry wolf, but
Right.
Dan, that's been kind of a council's call, and when they want to, if the majority of the council says move forward expeditiously, we're ready to roll. We've been holding off again to give kind of the downtown a little rest and reprieve after that
Right?
brutal
no, and I think they
second
needed
phase
it. I just
construction, yeah.
don't,
But
the lighting
Yeah.
to me is a
Yep.
concern that I wouldn't delay it too much longer than that.
So this is something you guys have recommended and voted on in committee?
In committee and council.
And council.
So
we are-
this is a park that was designed for, it's in the Habitat for Humanity community, and it was not really a park. It wasn't even usable the way it was designed out. It was a bunch of logs. So
Well, it's
we
a
needed to
small playground,
do
yeah.
something to elevate that, particularly since there's a lot of kids in that neighborhood.
Okay.
Dan, what's the grant? This is matching money for the grant. What was the grant amount for that park improvement?
We had a HUD grant and youth sports facility. One was 75,000, the other was, I want to say in the 60,000 mark. So we have quite a bit of funding.
So
available.
for Koinonia,
It's like 140,000.
so we're looking at $200,000 for that park?
Plus,
Yeah, it's a major upgrade. The playground equipment that was put in there was, as some of the others just stated, is grossly undersized for that.
it's also for the area, if you will, the Brayburn roadway, the neighborhood that's behind, back in there as well, because there's no park back there. So this is a pretty good-sized park for several homeowners within that region.
Back to Drew or Rob?
Okay, thank you very much, Dan. All right, so moving off this slide that describes changes in expenditure authority, we're going to talk about financial health a bit. We're going to start with the King County Trails Levy Fund. As you can see here, we're ending 2017, we estimate with a fund balance of $13,000. We started the year with $137,000, but that's declining to 13 because council approved the trail project in Community Park. But as you can see for 2018, we really don't have anything currently budgeted in terms of expenditures, so you can again see that increase up to $43,000 by the end of 2018. Just to get into kind of the King County Trails levy a bit, this is a voter-approved levy at the county level. Essentially, it authorizes an additional property tax of 19 cents per $1,000 assessed valuation. And it was approved for 2014 for a 5-year period. So you can expect King County to come back at 2019, seeking probably a, not sure what you'd call it, reissuing the levy for the most part. And to give you some idea, we have quite a few regional trails coming here through Snoqualmie. Their plan was to do what's in red that you see there, connecting different segments of the Preston Snoqualmie Trail with the Snoqualmie Valley Trail. I guess we'll have to check in with King County to see how much progress they're going to make on that. But we do receive a portion, $30,000, what we're anticipating per year to support any trails that we might want to connect to the regional trail system. So moving back into...
Reauthorize that levy. Voters have reauthorized it twice.
For the county.
Yeah, we get a cut of it.
Yeah, there's apportionment to the cities within the county of that levy.
But they have to be used to connect to the regional
It is
trails?
constrained per the levy for connecting of regional trails.
And they've reacquired the right-of-way, if you could flip back to the map real quick, across,
Tokel.
from the end of the trail on Tokel Road through, all the way through the mill site. The only area that has yet to be resolved is how to do a right-of-way or acquisition across the mill pond property still owned by Weyerhaeuser. Because Weyerhaeuser wants to sell them the entire property, including Borscht Lake, and given the uncertainties about what's in the lake,
Really?
county's not sure if they want to take it. And so everybody's trying to sort that out to get that trail alignment back across. But it's a critical missing link or piece in what is otherwise, 100 miles of regional trail that's broken right there.
Okay, so moving back into kind of pictures of financial health. In terms of Fund 122, the Jeannie Hansen Turf Replacement Fund, as you can see, we're not spending anything out of the Jeannie Hansen Turf Replacement Fund until we actually have to replace the synthetic turf up there. But we are collecting, in this fund, it's a transfer from the revolving reserve fund in the amount of $66,000 per year. by the end of 2018, we expect to have $309,000 in that fund. I'm not sure what the life cycle is on the synthetic turf. I thought we had at the Parks and Public Works Committee said maybe 10 years,
Yeah, it's about 15 years we're thinking.
15 years?
12 to 15, it depends upon usage too.
And the cost to replace is what?
1 point,
You're talking about replacing one,
Replacing the turf?
Yeah.
It's about 750 to 900, it
Per,
varies,
per field?
per field. And then without the lights, it extends the life of the field itself as well, because you can't use it too long into the night, so it actually benefits us.
so it's probably prudent for us to do some analysis behind this, given what Dan just said, to figure out how much we actually need to collect, because maybe $66,000 is not enough at the moment. Okay?
Well, and we did have, and maybe it'll come back again, consideration, council had consideration, putting lights on that field to extend the usability. And if we were to ever do that, it would require these field replacement quicker.
Right.
Okay, and then finally, in terms of the Parks Improvement Fund, financial health, basically over time, like I mentioned earlier, these are for capital projects, so there's no operational expenses coming out of this fund. There's a councilmanic transfer of $300,000 from the real estate excise tax fund into this fund to support parks improvement projects. We're anticipating spending $376,000 in 17 on park improvements, as well as $574,000 in 2018 on park improvements. By the end of 2018, we expect to have a carryover balance of $128,000. So given the fact that we are supporting a large number of parks, I think we'd have to check in with the parks portion in the CIP to see if there are any additional park improvements outward from there that we need to consider, which might drive us to increase the transfer amount from the real estate excise tax fund. But that analysis has not been completed.
Just so we're clear, these are mostly capital maintenance
Right.
of existing parks.
Yes.
Yeah, one of the challenges we anticipated, so the council anticipated several years ago, was the fact that, a lot of that infrastructure was aging in a similar time frame. And although the ridge all seems brand new, a lot of this stuff is coming up to 18, 20-year cycles. And so some of this playground equipment, along with streets, roads, and everything, we wanted to make sure and stay ahead of that curve to be very proactive in the ongoing maintenance of those facilities. So make sure things are replaced on a regular cycle.
So I think this is, again, back to the comment I made earlier. I don't necessarily see any concerns per se with what's being proposed, but I mostly just don't know. Because I don't know if the Genie Park replacement fund is big enough. I don't know if we're underfunding it
If it's
a
been
little, a lot. If the fund balance is adequate, if we're growing it fast enough. I don't know if this fund has too much fund balance, too little fund balance, and that was kind of my reaction to each one of these, is without kind of information that tells us what we're trying to get to. The information itself is fine. We're doing this. We're making this expenditure now. That these are good answers and reasonable things to do. But I don't think we're able to really assess these fund balances, and that's where I think we need to get to, is where we can say, look, we know these. Here's what we're doing with the fund balances. Here's what we're growing to. Here's the time frame. We're either behind, we're ahead, we're okay, we're not. Here's our plan of how. If we'd have a little bit more of that kind of thinking, then, by the way, that makes the decision on what you're doing in any given year much easier, because you just look to, well, where are we on the long-term plan? Okay, fine. Makes it a little bit easier to understand. Here,
Yeah, that's helpful feedback, Jim. So you're saying it's not more difficult than maybe putting an extra sentence or paragraph on here that says, given the CIP, which you're welcome to go dig into it and look at the 35 parks and all the,
exactly.
and what years we feel this is adequate to keep on top of, or we feel we're lagging or we're ahead. And then, if at the end you look at the big picture, you see in all these programmatic areas 5 that say that they're lagging behind, some are ahead, or they're all behind, then it gives you more of a measure of being able to say, well, what do you want to prioritize then? And
Exactly.
if things have to be.
Yeah, and I know that's a lot of work the first time, but once you've got that information, you're just updating it. So it's not a huge mountain every year. It's a huge mountain the first time.
Juan, this
Well,
isn't,
and one of the things we discussed previously was to treat parks maybe like we do our rolling fleet in terms of having a funding mechanism that recognizes the age of the infrastructures in each of these parks and what needs to be coming up, so that you're now looking at it on a schedule basis versus, okay, what's next? Because the what next is going to get you into trouble eventually. So I wholeheartedly agree with you in terms of what, where you envision this going.
And I believe some of that is elements of the CIP. Maybe we're just not just explaining it the way some councilors would like us to explain, because I understand that,
I think we're just missing the narrative, that's all Jim
right,
was saying.
that's,
Yeah, yeah, you're right on, Mr. Larson, is that one of the things that has really struck me about the city is my impression is that we have fantastic employees, fantastic staff that are doing a pretty fantastic job at just about everything they do. And when you go and talk to them, you ask questions, they know detailed answers. They can give you, you can say, well, what's that going to mean in 5 years, 10 years? They almost always know the answer. The question is, how do we get that out of their heads and into some form that everyone can access and understand how that ties into the money? So when we ask questions, as you see tonight, we get the answers. The one that just popped in my head, we asked how long on the park, on the turf well, 12 to 15 years, depending on use and the lights, is a very thorough answer. But unless we ask, it's not, that information is available. So it's all there. I agree with you. It's a question of how we're packaging up and helping people understand it.
I think the CIP would really help you. These guys have spent a lot of time on it, about 4 or 5 years, and the first 6 years iteration of it has the project, the priority, the improvements that are going to be made, and the funding mechanisms for it. So it's really pretty easy to follow. You can go right to this park or any park, and Dan has it pretty accurately mapped out. But I agree with you that no one would know that unless they knew where to look.
That's the next layer of the onion, is the term we use.
In fact,
But
Drew,
you
you were creating those sheets on the,
Right.
did you include all the different parks with improvements there too, or you haven't gotten there?
Phase basically is scheduled for next year.
Okay, I'll hand that off to
During the
Eric
budget
anyway.
process, right.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, we'd love to have an interactive map work with GIS where you could plug a lot of these projects in. So to make it really, really accessible, a resident could just pull up a map online, and anywhere they want to click on a park, on a street, or whatever, they could get this information pop up, about this, what's happening with the playground equipment in my neighborhood, my mini park. You could click on that, and it could say, hey, in 3 years, it's scheduled for replacement or improvement. Or
Like almost every line item should have what's called a BOE, basis of estimate. And for Jeannie Hansen in
I'm sorry,
particular,
Brian, if you could speak more into the microphone.
for Jeannie Hansen in particular, when we made that decision, we did discuss replacement costs for the turf, how long we thought the park was going to last. There could be one brief sentence that says, replacement costs estimated at this, lifespan expected at this, therefore we've set aside this amount of money per year for eventual replacement. That in the budget line item and in presentations like that would go a long way. And that's a budget thing, not necessarily a CIP thing. It's in the line item. So when somebody sees, $300,000 for Jeannie Hansen Park, it's a beautiful park. Why are we spending $300,000 on it? Well, we're not. We're putting money away to eventually spend to replace.
I just remind again that the object of our drill in the past has been to focus on the major changes. So that's a pretty good chunk of money. That's not all that Dan is doing in parks improvement next year. So we already have a budget and funding for some of the activities in the park improvement fund. We're just disclosing what the major changes are for. But I agree with you that it's not intuitive information. It doesn't leap out at you.
All right, so thank you very much for that discussion. Moving into enhancements. For the new council members, do you have a good concept of what I'm referring to as enhancements? Or would you like some more description?
Why don't you tell us?
Give us the 10-second spiel.
All right, so basically, I mentioned that we have kind of a line item budget here at the city of Snoqualmie. It is incremental in how we modify the expenditures on a year-to-year basis. So any account that's currently established for the most part. We're increasing either by inflation or by any payroll estimate that we need to come up with to do so. An enhancement is essentially an add to the budget. So if you had just a base budget increase for, say, next year, and if we recognize additional revenue that the city was going to collect in the next year, we would give the opportunity to department directors to form kind of an enhancement, I don't know what you would call it, wish list, right? Basically, to request how they might like to spend those additional dollars if we were willing to give it to them. So it's an increase above and beyond the base budget that we set before discussing with department directors.
So
I
it
had
could
a slightly
be
different
FTE,
definition.
it can be equipment, it can be a new program, a new,
Any additional
Policy.
expenditure not currently in the plan
correct.
is an enhancement at this stage.
Correct, but I think the distinction is if you're budgeting for grass seed, you're going to increase grass seed costs because that cost will go up by cost of living or
Cost of
CPI.
seed.
Whatever. But if you've never had grass seed in your budget, that's an enhancement. And that's a really simplistic
I think the
view.
line
I even go further, if grass seed's costing you $50 this year and it was $25 last year, you ought to have an enhancement to cover that additional $25.
we don't operate that way, though. You know, okay, these are major issues that we
Yeah,
look
no.
at. Okay, just so we're clear. Okay.
I oversimplified it.
No, but I think it's important we understand the distinction, though, because as Drew just mentioned, a lot of these things are inflation adjusted. And if we had a park that was, say, Gene Hansen, brand new, well, obviously we're going to have maintenance costs that's necessarily an enhancement the first year, but then becomes operational expense years after that. Even if we increase the budget for grass seed by 100% for that particular park, that's not going to be an enhancement request, just so we're clear.
How is the
I think-
park from the Habitat for Humanity, how is that not an enhancement then?
The,
It was design work.
so for Koinonia Park,
It was an enhancement.
Koinonia.
It's
Oh,
not a-
sorry.
It's not a misenhancement.
Well,
let's take a look.
go back up.
Go back.
You listed it as an enhancement on a previous slide.
It should be, yeah.
So some things are not enhancements. This is basically enhancements to the operating budget. I would say Koinonia Park, any improvement to that is a capital item that would then be included as a part of the capital improvement plan. And so I believe enhancements refer only to any changes or adds to the operating budget.
Oh, okay. Capital.
Well, I could be wrong on that. That's my interpretation as of right now. So take it with a grain of salt.
Respectfully disagree, but go on.
Okay, all right. Thank you, Councilman Hall. So,
Sorry, Drew, just one other thing, in your definition that I just wanted to pick up on,
that's,
is the way you said it, and I don't mean to be picking on you the way you said it if you didn't mean that, so don't, just clarify, but the way you said
you
it
can chide me,
was.
I'm free.
Okay. The way you said it was, if we find that we have extra money, maybe some revenue that we didn't plan on, then we look at how to spend it. That's sort of what you said. And I didn't like that, because I don't think that's how we should be prioritizing.
That's not the way we typically done it, Jim. I don't know if.
I was wondering if that wasn't a mistake.
Usually at the beginning of the year, the staff are usually in with their enhancement request before we get the next revenue projections and numbers. And usually it's like $1 million more than revenue we have, and then we have to go back and kind of give the bad news that once again, you're gonna have to axe most of what they're requesting. So.
All right, and so then the things that didn't get approval to move forward because they couldn't fit in the budget, I assume they stay on a list somewhere and perhaps have some sort of prioritization attached to them, and then
Yeah.
as you move forward, they perhaps reappear in future budgets and hopefully perhaps someday get funded. Is that kind of how it works?
Correct, and sometimes the council's requested to see that list, so.
Okay, so that's fantastic. So it's not really the flavor of, when we end up with some more money, we just spend it. It's, if we end up with some more money, we may put that away to avoid future tax increases. The spending is a separate question than the discovering that we have more revenue. Is
Right.
that true?
Correct.
Good, okay.
Just so we're,
Don't make it through their review, regardless of what the cost.
Most don't usually make it.
and then those enhancements, some do not come back necessarily. It could be for a new program. We just say, no, we're not gonna do it, and then we just forgo the.
And some we know are gonna take 2 or 3 years to strategically, whether it's working in a year or two toward a levy like we did for the firefighters and the police officer, when we identified over a course of two or 3 years that we had a growing need or gap for resources in those departments. Or it's like doing some of the economic development stuff that we know that, you know, when the new hotel or the Safeway comes in, revenue comes, then we can finally get to some things that we've been putting off.
So inside the organization, we did score the enhancements. Indeed, the request for spending was more than the available revenue that we had, and so we used essentially criteria in order to score those enhancement packages from each department. One criteria was goal conformity. How does it match what the council wants to do? We did have a 2015-16 council goals and objectives that we would use to analyze each enhancement against that for the most part, and score it accordingly to this 0, 1, 2 rubric. In addition to that, we considered whether enhancement would be used to, well, if it was necessary because we had a mandate from the state, or if there was some liability that we needed to take care of. So if it really tried to tackle liability that could result in higher expenses for the city down the road, maybe through lawsuits, then we would score that enhancement higher. In addition, we would consider efficiencies. So does, say, this IT project improve the amount of time our B&O clerk has to spend processing B&O tax payments, for example? If it does, well, by how much? Could we estimate by how much? And as a result, how can we then use her time to do something different? And then furthermore, what's the community impact? So what's the benefit that we could potentially derive from that enhancement? We would do our best to essentially estimate what that potential impact is to the community. And then finally, we would consider how wide is the impact? Is it impacting just one business or residents in a cul-de-sac, or is it impacting the community, everyone within the community, for example? So those were the 5 criteria that we used to score enhancements this past year. Sorry, I said I have it hyperlinked. So we go back to the agenda. Let me go back to the Parks and Public Works Committee review. And we will go back to the proper page. All right, so I mentioned enhancements. There were 6 enhancements related to parks. Just to kind of give a progress update on how we're doing to complete those enhancements. So we were planning on spending $20,000 in 2017 to grind, overlay, crack seal, and strip several parking lots. That might be considered a capital maintenance project for Catherine's benefit down there.
You're probably referring to the striping or,
Sorry, stripping.
that's, yeah, striping, yeah, just so we're clear.
And then we were planning on, there was an enhancement for $6,000 per year to replace failing bollards throughout the park system. That's currently unspent right now. And then basically, we were planning on spending $40,000 per year to perform routine maintenance to the Snoqualmie Park pathway. That's alongside the Snoqualmie Parkway, including the grind, replace, crack seal, and coat of needed areas. And that is currently in progress as we speak.
So, okay, keep going.
So furthermore, we've got 3 other parks-related enhancements. We're still in the planning stages of spending $50,000 per year for the trimming and or replacement of diseased or overgrown trees. In progress right now, we're getting to spend upwards of $25,000 per year for supplies necessary to maintain the urban forestry program, to restore open spaces, maintain trails, and so on. And then lastly, we were planning on spending, it's currently in progress because we're all partaking in the events that are here in this community, spending $168,000 per year for events programming.
Events programming, does that include people
That's
Yes.
the contract as it exists right
Contract
now.
plus the cost of the actual events.
$50,000 you set aside for
Okay.
supplies, materials, so on and so forth, yeah.
Which includes the Main Street program activities too, primarily downtown.
So, Councilmember Holloway, this question is specifically to address your concern from the Parks and Public Works Committee meeting, but we can hold off until the next committee if wanted.
Correct, so we have all the, we've got $309,000 worth of enhancements we just talked about.
All right, so then we will go through that. So you're looking at adopted expenditures for 2017 and 2018, as well as amended expenditures. So I'm just gonna focus, and you're wondering, why is there a $0 change? Am I correct?
Correct.
Interpreting? All right, so then moving on to the next slide. To try to answer your question, we're just gonna focus on 2017. If you noticed the bullet points that I had next to the adopted expenditures and the amended expenditures, you'll see that in the two right-hand columns over there. You'll also see that I've added some additional information. If you take a look at the dates, you'll see that the preliminary budget was offered to council on October the 12th, 2016. We adopted a budget, council adopted a budget on December 12th, 2016, and the amended budget we're considering here now is scheduled for adoption of December the 11th, 2017. So the enhancements themselves were actually added into the preliminary budget, which is the reason why you're not seeing a dollar change between the two right-hand columns. That is the moment when the enhancements were added to the budget.
So you're telling me the enhancements are already in the budget?
The enhancements were already in the budget.
Then,
So how are the enhancements? Is that your next question?
so how are the enhancements once the enhancement is approved, it's part of the budget? What you're asking now is for basically approval of mid-budget enhancements. If these are not mid-biennial enhancements, we don't need to discuss them. We already approved it.
I don't think that you're asking for approval of new enhancements. In fact,
No, I'm not. Essentially,
we
we're
don't have any new enhancements. What he is trying to show, I think, is the progress on them and where we're at. And there are some enhancements that we budgeted for 2017 that we are not going to get to, so they're making an adjustment to show that those expenditures won't happen in 2017 and will happen in 2018. So you have a timing issue of those.
I'm trying to integrate performance in the conversation.
No, but
Councilmember Pruitt is exactly right from my perspective.
That's gonna drive Brian nuts, what you just said.
right. I think she's right, but the mechanics are wrong. Okay, so I have an approved budget that I am leading into in this biennial review. It has X amount of dollars. At the end of this, I'm gonna come out with Y amount of dollars based on enhancements or whatever. I need to know the pluses and minuses in between there that get me from one to the other. If it is an enhancement that is already approved and is in the 375, it's not in the middle, it was prior.
Yes.
Okay, so I don't need to discuss it at this stage, it's in the budget. It's no longer an enhancement, it's a line item in the budget.
Well, remember, this is the first time we've been through a mid-year, so you get to make up the rules of what you want to see, so.
Told it could be anything I wanted, yes.
I know, well, now we're giving you too much. Jeez, Brian. Make up your mind.
It's real simple, I just want the math equation that says, this is where I was, this is where I'm going to be, and these are the pluses and minuses that get me across that gap.
Well, I think part of our problem is in government budgeting. You know, at work, we go over and under, you don't amend your budget. In government work, you have to amend the adoption because you can't spend money that is not.
Have a legal requirement.
So I think that there's an appropriation layer that you and I are not used to having to do.
Oh, I would disagree, I'm used to it.
Oh, I got a little-
We go through a process every month, pluses and minuses.
Because you're quasi-government.
Part of it well, I can't speak to
It's
large
probably-
aerospace company accounting practices.
Yeah.
I'm not an accountant. but we go through it.
Well, you're special. We've done that.
It's a special company, I will agree.
So Drew.
So I think, is that a true statement, Drew, in terms of the enhancements that the 6 enhancements, you were just showing those as where we're at in those certain
Exactly.
progress?
Yeah, I'm trying to reflect the performance.
Kathy,
of
how
what
is
we're calling.
anybody going to be able to understand this if I'm basically given 3 disjointed numbers?
I'm not arguing that at all. We understand it because we have lived and breathed this budget for years upon years. So when we hold up the 147 pages, you and I and Bob and Matt have been through that document so many times that in my opinion, we've lost sight of telling the story of that document. And I think we've also lost sight of making this something that somebody from outside of this organization, a resident, whoever, pick up and actually understand. And I think that's what Jim's been trying to articulate so well. So I'm agreeing with you. I'm agreeing with you, Brian.
Only that if I can't take this piece of document and explain to somebody why I started with $375,000 budget, I end with $375,000 budget, and I put some $300,000 worth of enhancements in here, how does that math work out? I'm not sure I've done my job. So we need to look how we're talking this. Ralph, go on.
Okay,
Do you mind if I make a couple of, I don't know, the slide might be confusing here. We're not appropriating the events money into 303.
no.
Yeah.
There are 3 enhancements
Yeah.
listed as a part of that first question up
Okay,
there.
okay. Well, I just wanted to make a couple of introductory comments before this gets any duller. The next portion of the slides are the utilities, financing, and infrastructure. And there's a lot of funds here. We're moving a lot of money around. I thought maybe I'd just give a couple of boring comments. Their sewer, water, and stormwater each have their own operating fund, largely for maintenance, administration, and operations. But they also have a role in funding the capital improvement plan. When we set this up, you still awake? We set this up in 2015. The current model that you're working on is the first 6 years of a much longer capital improvement plan. And of course, Brian and Mrs. Pruitt will recall that we spent weeks and weeks and weeks in many council meetings figuring out how to finance this, and in so doing, moderate the impact on rates as much as we could. In general, the model has us funding these projects 20% cash from rates, and 70 to 80% borrowing, also to moderate the impact on rates. I mean, just a quick example is that Dan is getting ready to open bids. Where'd he go? Open bids for, huge remodeling and upgrade of the wastewater treatment plant, $13 million. Obviously, if we paid cash for that, we would wipe out the funds in all 3 utilities, operating and capital. So this is a strategy that we put together, and at least unless it hasn't changed, we agreed to the first 2 years of it back in 2015. So the transfers from the operating funds are the cash portion of the CIP improvements. They go into a consolidated bond fund, bond construction fund, and from that we build the projects, expense the projects out. Also in that fund are the proceeds of a bond anticipation note, which you approved, actually an extension of one that we passed in 2015, but expired before we could get all the projects done. So you refinanced that, well, just a couple months ago, right? Mm-hmm. So those proceeds, bond anticipation note is a note given to a bank. We pay interest to them in anticipation of issuing bonds to knock off that credit in the future. So it's very much like a construction loan for a home. You go and you borrow some interim financing when you build a house, it's replaced with a mortgage or some other permanent construction financing. It's exactly the same thing here. So we are moving a lot of money around because all of our plans and projects didn't materialize in 2017. Excuse me, 2017. And that's what this next section's about.
All right, so we're going to skip through that. We're going to move on to the Finance Administration Committee. Thank you very
Oh,
much.
we
for
are.
the Separation.
What I was going to say is just a point to a time, are you going to be, I was hoping to maybe get 4 or 5 minute break between this and the
Yeah,
council meeting.
I
so-
think if we could
We can do it.
try to cut off at, 6:50 for the most part. No, Councilmember Pruitt, if you wanted to get into reserves, because we had a very interesting discussion then. So I'm just gonna flip ahead.
So, there's no surprises in, let me find my list. The mayor's budget, administration, legal, city clerk, finance, communication. So, those are pretty much, what they were, what they'll remain, pretty much intact. The only true change in any of our general fund is under the council. We did have the, Peterson Memorial, so you'll see a little bit of an increase there. For the new council members, we do maintain a small budget at the council level. Tonight's dinner, for instance, is paid from that, so it's usually a pretty small amount, but that's why you have that budget. We really focused in our conversation about, we have 3 reserve funds: the contingency reserve fund, the operating reserve fund, and the revolving reserve fund. Two of them are set through our fiscal policies at a 5% target. The contingency reserve fund by law can't be more than
37.5 cents per
Thank you,
$1,000.
per thousand. So these all have a very healthy reserve amount. Do you have the, actually, there you go. So at the, are those ending, oh, they are ending. So ending fund balances at the end of 2017, almost 4 million and then almost 4.5 million. And these were set aside for various reasons. You want to make sure that you have operating liquidity so that you only collect taxes twice a year in King County.
Correct.
So,
Property taxes.
yeah, property taxes. So it helps, if you run into a cash flow issue. We also have set asides for quote-unquote rainy days or flood events. There was a winter that we had 3 separate flood events in the same fiscal year. So it's recognizing that you might have extraordinary costs in a particular cycle. The bond raters love the fact that we have reserves. This is very much a cornerstone of one of the reasons why we have the rating that we do. But that 5% that I was mentioning earlier with the fiscal policies, that was literally a council discussion, I believe in 2005 or 6, that we said stop spending one-time revenues on operational. We want to be setting those aside. Let's set up these other 2 reserve types. And we literally pulled 5% out of the air as a target. So one of the things I would highly recommend 2018, and I would recommend that start with your council retreat, is to start discussing what the appropriate level of reserves are. I have no conceptual idea, but how much does a city of our size really want to reserve for those activities that I was talking about? Some of it is very analytical. You know what your cash flow looks like for a period of time, and you can set monies aside appropriately for that. But thinking through what could happen in a year in terms of natural disaster or, that type of thing is a little bit more nebulous. So F&A had a very large discussion about kind of proceeding with this, starting the conversation at the retreat. I think it's going to be a year-long discussion leading into your 2019 budget, but I would highly recommend, because if the analysis shows that we have too much in these ending fund balances. You want to deploy these ending fund balances to, in my opinion, capital projects, but wherever you see fit.
So just to
Drew, did
provide you.
that kind of sum it
Yeah,
up?
that segues well into what this slide shows up here, which is essentially the difference between,
Sorry, Drew,
yes,
take that presentation, make it into slides, and that's it. Stone cold, that's what you need to do. Make everything, just go back and play the tape and make that into a slide, and that's how you present this budget. She explained all the funds. Go back and look at it, and you'll see that that's a home run. That's how, if you could present it, each and every one of these, it will help everyone to understand exactly the context, the numbers, what's important, why it's important, and then now the rest of what you're about to say is going to be very easy for you.
okay. So just getting into this a little bit, the difference between the amended ending fund balances and the reserve requirements, as you can see, in terms of the total, we've got about $1.28 million that were over policy in 2017, and then $1.74 million that were over policy in 2018. Basically, what I wanted to do with this is to compare how much we've actually reserved on a basis in comparison to our general fund expenditures or revenues, for example, and compare that to what other cities and their policies are. And you can compare us, we're at 29%. The average for the cities that I have listed here is at 15%. And so that might be one thing that you want to consider if we're going to conduct a reserve analysis down the road.
So be careful, though, because the downturn, a lot of these cities had to adjust services and/or personnel. So
And they
while
dug
it's while it's a good apples to apples type comparison, you know, there's more layers to this than just go out and compare yourself to your neighboring
Especially on a
communities.
percentage basis. You need to look at the base of the general funds for each of these and the monies they have. 'cause
Sorry, Mayor, kind
some
of
of these cities are
interrupted you.
larger
That's right.
in size and scope.
Absolutely right. And then the other thing I'd say is you need to look at, because those cities have very different revenue sources than ours.
Yes.
Well, one of them is just like us, which I won't comment on, but I'll just say that it's interesting that they're where they are, which is the one that's lowest on the list has a revenue stream set that looks very like ours.
Yes.
But the others look very different. And so remember, too, that in downturns, your different revenue streams will behave differently. So a primarily sales tax-oriented city is going to have a much harder time in a downturn than one that is, say, primarily property tax. Although, if you have a property recession, so you have different kinds of recessions. If property values go down, then so it's a fairly complex thing to do to try and benchmark.
Be fairly important for council to discuss as part of your fiscal policies.
Yeah.
Actually, we're very well cushioned even when our property values drop, the millage rate rolls up, and so it's fairly stable revenue source in that regard.
I would also suggest that you look at your policies. It's been a while since we've looked at it, and I think you're due for maybe a little bit more in-depth conversation with the rating agency. So very first thing they look at is your policies and how you're adhering to them. So look at your policies not only from you know, an overall policy and levels and what you're trying to do, but also are you practicing what's in there? For instance, I believe we have subsequently removed it, but for a while we said we wouldn't use no debt and we were using debt. So you don't want to get into that incongruity with before you go before a rating agency. It doesn't go well if you.
So
I was just going to add that, yeah, the part of the impact, I mean, some of these cities are still recovering to replenish those funds from the recession, even. It can take several years or a decade or more. But the other side of it, the flip side of it is we have been intentionally, particularly in the last year and a half, ramping up the reserves in anticipation that we were going to hit kind of a trough or a momentary gap between projects like the Salish expansion that had been delayed well over 13 years or so. The projects we thought would be coming online, bringing in additional, more diverse revenues to the city as we reach the full build out of Snoqualmie Ridge, and we're just seeing a bit of a gap in the that those aren't quite synchronizing or coming together the way we thought, so we wanted to build up the reserves enough to at least weather the period through that gap before those other revenue sources start coming into play.
So basically, all I wanted to do was recognize recommended standards from different agencies, and then I wanted to get into a bit about risk and uncertainties. So as part of our conversation and discussion on revenue source stability, infrastructure risk, vulnerability to extreme events, and so on. After that, because we're kind of running out of time, I wanted to get into stress testing a bit, but that is something that we could save for later. It's
That's so
basically
a
based
retreat.
on the risk factors just listed.
What can you do in 3 minutes?
Well,
Well, I
no,
want to get
it's,
to public safety, so,
go ahead if you want to summarize.
I was just gonna suggest, I think everybody can take a look at the slides, we all got the packet, and I think this is where you wanna spend some time at the retreat and have Drew or Rob or staff really dive into these and give you a grounding. I know Jim and Brian know risk-based, analysis, they probably have had to stress test quite a bit, but for the other members, yeah. So can we switch over to public safety real quick? So public safety, we reviewed fire, and I'm gonna steal a little bit of Drew's thunder just so that we can keep things going, progressing quite a bit. Can you pull up the slide? That's a different one than I had, that one. One of the things that we wanted to draw everybody's attention to, just because there's been some conversation going on out in the public about use of overtime, both fire and police, which you'll hear about at the next meeting, but fire in particular, they do use overtime to staff from a couple different perspectives. Much of it is reimbursed by outside organizations. So when we're looking at the expense of why is there so much overtime, sometimes it's offset by revenues, and that just doesn't quite make the bridge. So we're not telling that story very well. For instance, the Boeing Classic, that would be an overtime expense, whereas that organization is paying for it through a revenue stream. Another one is if we send firefighters out on wildfire, that is paid back through DNR. So you're not seeing that revenue stream necessarily match up with the expense of overtime. You're just seeing these enormous hours of overtime. The other thing that we spend overtime on in both police and fire is for staffing. We have a finite pool of firefighters and police officers, and when we have one out on injured, for an injury or something, somebody's got to pick up those shifts. So you do end up using a little bit of overtime throughout the year just for the normal course of staffing. So just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention. I think everything else on the slides are pretty self-explanatory, but if not, we can pick it up at the next meeting, because I just made Matt's 5 minute.
Okay.
You nailed it, it's right at 5:02.
I know.
All right, so with that, we're gonna adjourn the special budget meeting.
Drew, thank you very
PJ, I
much.
assume you guys are gonna dial that off?